Okay, good evening. My name is Lucas Stearns, and this is my oral presentation for our Seminar 3 Investigate Cybercrime Part 1. We're just going to go right ahead and get into it, and we're going to start with the crime scenario which I created for this project. So as it reads, an arrest warrant has been issued for a 27-year-old man who has been identified as Samuel Marshall. Mr. Marshall has been identified as being involved in several reported cases of identity theft and fraud. The victims have reported receiving phone calls from their banks and credit unions stating that their accounts have been compromised. At this time, it is believed that Mr. Marshall has obtained upwards of $5,000 in money and other assets by using computer technology to hack into private files and obtain social security numbers for the theft and creation of credit cards under an assumed identity. Units are currently inbound to Mr. Marshall's known address to serve the arrest warrant. Now, even though this scenario is fictional, this is actually a very typical scenario of one commonly views when they think of identity theft, the cybercrime of identity theft. Now, while it's become, in this day and age, kind of a popular term in terms of criminal justice, identity theft actually has a bit of a long history. Traditionally speaking, identity theft was used to describe any general use of stolen personal information. As with a lot of criminal justice definitions, they've been furthered along as the years have gone by to make a more comprehensive picture or comprehensive view, particularly in what can be done with those stolen identities, which is where we get the term identity fraud. So by definition, identity fraud is the use of a vast array of illegal activities based on fraudulent use of identifying information of a real or fictitious person. Now, once a person has accomplished this, they're essentially able to create a fictitious identity under the guise of the real identity. And once that's done, the possibilities are endless for what they can do. One of the common actions is to open credit cards under another person's social security number. And by having access to the social security number, they have access to bank accounts and a myriad of other possibilities. Now, there are multiple types of identity fraud. Probably the rarest form of identity fraud is what is called assumption of identity. And as the name implies, this means basically that the individual assumes the identity of their victim. Now, being that in the long run, it's somewhat difficult to completely accomplish assuming someone else's identity. Like I said, this is an exceptionally rare form of identity fraud. In fact, it's probably the rarest form. But along the lines of assuming a new identity is what is basically called the theft of employment and or border entry. Now, what this means in definition is the fraudulent use of stolen or fictitious personal information to obtain employment or to gain entry into the United States. Now, this has become increasingly common with the growth of illegal immigration, and so this particular type of, I guess what you could call not necessarily the assumption of someone's identity, but the assumption of a new identity, is actually fairly more common. Now, another type of identity fraud, which is a little less malicious than what a lot of people view as identity fraud, is what's called reverse criminal record identity. Now, when this happens, this occurs when essentially a criminal, or for example an ex-convict, uses another person's identity simply to seek gainful employment. Now, this type of identity fraud is often overlooked because it's not, when you compare identity fraud like credit card fraud or social security fraud, those are very financially damaging types of identity fraud, whereas this one is not. It's both not common, and it's really, financially speaking, it's really not that critically damaging. Now, the most common type of identity fraud, as we're talking about critical financial damage, is the same one that I described in the above fictional scenario, which is credit identity theft or fraud. Now, as the name implies, this type of identity fraud involves the use of stolen personal and financial information to facilitate the creation of fraudulent accounts. Now, this one is probably by far the most common type of identity fraud, and it's the most common identity fraud case that people are aware of. When people think of identity fraud, this is the one that they think of because it is the most common, and arguably it's probably the one that people fear the most, because when criminals are able to do this, the amount of damage that they can cause is astronomical. People lose years of savings in their bank accounts, their credit gets damaged, and it takes often a long time for people to recover from that damage. Now, more often than not, identity theft and fraud is used by cyberspace technology. Now, with that being said, by being used in cyberspace, it is considered a cybercrime because most of the crime is taking place through digital devices. It may not necessarily be computers, but nevertheless, it is used by digital devices through cyberspace, so it is considered a cybercrime. Now, being that it's a cybercrime, it has somewhat of a unique investigation process. Now, in the beginning stages, it's pretty similar to a traditional criminal activity investigation. The biggest difference is in the preparation of the investigation, specifically in preparation for the evidence that comes in. It's vital to the investigation process to have a well-maintained forensic laboratory that is specifically wired for the analysis of computer-related evidence for the sake of the courtroom presentation. Now, as with other traditional investigations, warrants of course must be prepared and applied for in a court of law, which of course also requires probable cause for the arrest and seizing of the computer or digital equipment as evidence. Now, I have here in this presentation a list, and this is the process for processing a scene of the crime. It's involved in traditional investigations, but it also follows for cybercrime. So, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and list these word for word. They must include in the documentation, at a minimum, the date, time, and location of the search, and a chronological timeline of all investigative steps taken during the process, the identity of all individuals present at the scene upon arrival, the identity of all investigative personnel assisting in the scene processing, which includes names, ranks, and badge numbers of all officers, the names, positions, and contact information for non-departmental personnel, the descriptions, locations of all computers, devices, or media located throughout the search, including CPUs, monitors, keyboards, external storage devices, and etc. And this is very specific towards cybercrime investigations. And physical condition of all computer equipment located at the scene, including visible damage. Now, this may be important, specifically including the visual damage. This would be very important to protect the corresponding department from any allegations of abuse, because these do belong to people, at least for the most part. Presence and status of network connections, and the presence of a dial tone in cases where modems are used for connection purposes. Identification of all material or equipment which is seized, and detailed description of the scene. Status of all computers at the scene, including a description of what the computer is doing. For example, if it's turned on or off, if it's connected to the internet, documents are open, programs are open. There must be a chronological timeline of all investigative clues and developing leads, date, time, and description of any investigative software used, and a brief justification. Whether the potential for external destruction, including mechanical, weather, or magnetic, exists, and a detailed chain of custody report. Now, as it implies, the types of evidence you find in a cybercrime scene will include desktop and laptop computers, monitor screens, keyboards, telephones, or more commonly nowadays cell phones, wallets and purses, which could have been stolen, clothing, trash cans and recycle bins, printers, and internal computer components, just to list a few of them. The purses and the clothing are important because these could have been obtained through these false accounts that were achieved through identity fraud. Basically, any piece of equipment that has access to cyberspace and any items that could be obtained through identity fraud must be collected as evidence. So this is the basic of a cybercrime investigation, and I hope this was very informative, and thank you very much for your time.